Dr. Xiaoyu Pu and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another nice webinar on red mask and white mask, mixed signals in China's regional diplomacy. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. China Studies is one of our major research centers. China Studies as a whole brings into perspective the rising powers mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly had the aptitude to either overturn or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategic thinking and conduct, foreign and security policy, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. It further addresses China's emergence in the face of the world in flux, domestic politics, economy, society, culture, PLA, and Tibet Autonomous Region, and most importantly, her engagement with each of South Asian countries. To talk on this very interesting topic of today, we have Dr. Xiaoyu Pu. I have been reading Dr. Pu since long, but had the opportunity to meet him in real only last year in Shanghai. We would like to welcome Dr. Pu and thank him for his time. Dr. Xiaoyu Pu is an associate professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Reno. He was born in 1979 in Sichuan, China, and grew up there. He received his bachelor's and master's in political science from Nankai University in Tianjin. After moving to United States, he got another master's from Kent State University and eventually received his Ph.D. in political science from the Ohio State University. In the 2012 to 13 academic year, he was postdoctoral fellow at Princeton-Harvard China and the World Program at Princeton University. In 2016, he was a Stanton Fellow at Fundação Getulio Vargas in Brazil. He started working as an assistant professor of political science at University of Nevada, Reno in 2013. Dr. Pu was promoted to the rank of associate professor with tenure in 2019. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. His teaching and research focus on Chinese foreign policy, East Asia politics, emerging world power, and the international relations theory. Dr. Pu is the author of Rebranding China, Contested Status Signaling in the Changing Global Order. His research has appeared in International Security, International Affairs, the China Quarterly, and the China Journal of International Politics. He is the editor of the Chinese Journal of International Politics, which is published by Oxford University Press, and an editorial board member of Foreign Affairs Review, Beijing. Dr. Pu is the founder and moderator of GCIR and a global scholarly listserv on China and international relations, promoting cooperation among many emerging Chinese scholars. The list has grown into a global scholarly network with more than 500 scholars participating around the world. Dr. Pu, you have around 30 to 40 minutes to make your initial remarks, which will be followed by question and answers. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their questions in the Zoom chat and in the comment box under Facebook Live. Dr. Pu, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the warm introduction, and it's my great pleasure and honor to give a speech here. So I should emphasize the topic is very complicated. I share the view, a perspective as an individual scholar. I don't represent any government institutions. So that means I can say anything. But the downside is that I might not know some of the situation going on the ground. So in terms of diplomacy, military. So here I will provide some sort of bigger picture, some analytic framework. Hopefully this framework can help you understand China's foreign policy, China's regional diplomacy in Asia. So part of my talk draw upon my recent book called Rebranding China. So part of that book talking about one chapter focused on regional diplomacy. So that's sort of some background information regarding this talk. So the title of the talk is Red Mask and White Mask, mixed signaling in China's regional diplomacy. It's related to a big question. So what is China's sort of ideal image in the region, right? So if we think about China as an actor, what kind of image does China want to project, regionally or globally? So in the Western media, in the United States, from about 7 or 80 years ago, there's a popular discussion about the emergence of so-called assertive China. So far earlier than the Trump administration. So from the year around the 2009 or 2008, there's a rising narrative about assertive China. So if we use an analogy, is China a wolf, which will be threatening to other countries, or is China a ship with benign intention? So, but the reality probably even more complicated. So sometimes I use this 2x2 chart to illustrate the point. Is China a ship in a ship's clothing? That's from a more sort of a defensive perspective. Or China is a wolf in a wolf's clothing. That's from offensive realist perspective. Professor Mearsheimer might assume all great power is or should be a wolf. Or there could be other complicated situation. Is China a wolf in the ship's clothing? That's strategic deception. Or China is a ship in a wolf's clothing. That's sort of exaggerated threat. So overall, I argue that the image of a rising power could be more complicated. Again, as I mentioned, according to one particular perspective, like Professor Mearsheimer, okay, a great power is a wolf in a wolf's clothing, no doubt about it. So in recent years, that kind of pessimistic view about China's intention, image, that become popular in different parts of the world, right? We see news report about the global backlash against China, talking about the sharp power, China's influence against some of the Western sort of democracies, and those Western democracies push back. So we see those kind of reports talking about think tank scholars in Germany, for instance, worry about China's spreading authoritarianism in Europe. So this is global backlash. Of course, the Trump administration pursued a very sort of competitive approach against China. So the national security strategy emphasized China, quote, China seeks to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, expand the reaches of its state-driven economic model, and reorder the region in its order. So basically describe China as a threatening wolf. And a former senior military leaders, Harry Harris, now he is a U.S. ambassador to South Korea. A few years ago, he said, quote, I believe China seeks hegemony in East Asia. So these are some of the images about China internationally. So if we think about China's image, I think this is contrast to the conventional wisdom or conventional view about China's international image. The conventional view often emphasizes China wants to promote its soft power, public diplomacy, build a better image. So emphasize those sort of benign image. A rising power wants to promote its soft power. So, or public diplomacy. That's kind of traditional focus of image building in China's foreign policy. I argue that the traditional approach ignore the other side of the story, that the bad image. So I want to emphasize the benign image, and also the conventional wisdom or the traditional view often emphasize benign, a good national image, and sometimes puts this as a sort of a dichotomy. If China wants to promote a good image, China must sacrifice its national interest. So I argue that actually national interest and the national image, they are compatible to each other in most cases. We need to think about the two together instead of think about them as separated issues. So I borrowed some ideas from the Peking opera. So some people, if you are familiar with Peking opera, there are two types of typical roles in a Peking opera. One is red mask, the other is white mask. They actually symbolize two types of roles: positive role or coercive role or battle role. So sociologist Avery Goffman, he published a classical book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, talking about how average people or individuals present different images in daily life. Robert Jervis borrowed that ideas. He published a book called The Logic of Images in International Relations. So these are some of the bigger theoretical framework I borrow from. And as I emphasized, in the Chinese context, Peking opera emphasized two types of mask. Red mask is like a good cop. White mask is like a bad cop. So here's my argument. I emphasize using Robert Jervis' logic image. I argue that the desired image of China is not necessarily always a benign image. Reassurance is one aspect of the story, but the other aspect of story is deterrence. So reassurance and deterrence are two sides of the same coin. Sometimes states have strategic reason to be feared. So that's Robert Jervis' original statement. I borrow that argument, try to apply to China, in the sense that China's sort of desired image is not always the red mask, the benign positive role. And actually, the part of the other side of the story is that sometimes China also wants to project image as an image of white mask. That means a more coercive image. If we think about China's regional strategy, so I argue that while reassuring some regional countries about its peaceful intentions, China is also striving to maintain its credibility of deterrence and coercion. So sometimes China might want to be feared rather than be liked. So again, the reality is complicated. So I'm talking about two sort of simple sort of model or simple images. So if we think about China's regional diplomacy since the 1990s, so we might see many examples of two images or two masks. So first, it's about charm offensive, benign leadership in East Asia. So some scholars even conceptualize two ways of charm offensive. One is after Asian financial crisis. The other is after 2013, China's internal or regional diplomacy conference. So the first wave after Asian financial crisis, China refused to devalue its currency, provided package to Thailand in terms of support package, and it also was very active in terms of building multilateral regional institutions since late 1990s. So from this, China wants to project the image of a responsible regional leaders. So that's kind of image. And as I mentioned, the recent wave is after the 2013 regional diplomacy conference, very high level conference in Beijing. So we see the Chinese leaders mention these different concepts: amity, sincerity, mutual benefit, inclusiveness. Of course, this is diplomatic rhetoric. I know in reality, maybe there are many differences, but at least they have a vision, regional vision, in which China could play a more positive leadership role. And also Belt and Road Initiative, most of you probably very familiar. And also in terms of conference, during conference on the confidence building measures in Asia. So Xi Jinping laid out the so-called vision of Asian security. So overall, the first aspect of the story is that China wants to project the image as a responsible, benign regional leaders in Asia. But people sometimes forget there is the other side of China's regional diplomacy. That's deterrence and coercive diplomacy. But the coercive image is not new in China's foreign policy. So based on some historical analysis, we might see some sort of regularity. China implements a calculus of signals in coercive diplomacy. First, to send signals of deterrence. If deterrence failed, China justifies its use of military force as being defensive. I'm not saying this is justifiable or not. I'm talking about a historical pattern, how China think about design its coercive diplomacy in the region. In terms of sovereignty, this territory dispute, Chinese leaders or officials often emphasize China should safeguard its sovereignty and territorial claim. And in terms of behavior, some Western analysis using the term tsunami slicing, that means China trying to strengthen its claims incrementally without making a move dramatically enough to justify a major response by others. Of course, it's not always successful, even this kind of strategy, but we are talking about a behavior pattern. A few years ago, I published a co-author article trying to conceptualize China assertiveness. I argue that there are three types of assertiveness: the offensive, defensive, and constructive. So China's regional assertiveness sometimes might have the potential to be expansive, but also sometimes it could be positive if China is willing to share more responsibilities. But in many cases, China's assertiveness could also be conceptualized as so-called defensive assertiveness. That means China has not changed its claims. It's just China has increased its capabilities and a willingness to defend its existing claims. So again, I'm not saying this is positive, but I'm saying how to understand some of China's regional behavior pattern is that for most of these maritime or territorial disputes, China has not changed its claims. It's just now it's strengthened its capabilities to defend its claims. That generated new worries, uncertainty in the region, right? So that's the situation. A little bit more illustration of these two images: a benign regional leader versus coercive image. So let me give you some examples One example is China's maritime disputes in Asia, right, with Japan and also with many Southeast Asian countries in the south over the South China Sea. It's a very complicated issue. I don't want to get all these details debate about historical, international legal regulations, diplomacy. It's a little bit all sort of it's complicated, multi-dimensional issue in terms of maritime disputes. But I remember some interesting sayings say why it's multi-dimensional. So there's a famous legal saying in the United States said, if the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. If both the laws and the facts are against you, pound the table. So that's a famous American writer and journalist, Carl Sandburg, he said. But I think if you borrow that term, we might understand China and all the regional, these regional countries over disputing South China Sea, they all have different arguments. Some get arguments from history, international law, they have different interpretation of international law. It's very complicated. I have no desire to settle the disputes, but my only observation is that it's very complicated issue. So in terms of South China Sea disputes, China has all these territorial disputes with these countries, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and all the others. So in terms of histories, right, most of you understand this, the 9 dash line. Originally, it was 11 dash line in the Republic of China era, and also based on international law of the sea, different countries could claim 200 miles economic exclusive zone. So there's also whether those islands are islands or others, how to identify those. There are different interpretations. So again, I'm not trying to settle these complicated international legal dispute or diplomatic historic disputes, but I just want to also China emphasize its historical perspective, but how to understand China's sort of assertiveness in sort of South China Sea disputes, right? So I think this is related to my previous concept called defensive assertiveness, is that one is China has increased its capabilities to defend its claim. So that's a big change. Many years ago, there were like 9 government agencies dealing with maritime issues. So some Chinese scholars say 9 dragons dealing with the sea, right? So 九龙闹水, 9 dragons. Very chaotic decision making. Now China has strengthened its internal agencies. These agencies are more sort of better. They are better coordinated. They are better funded. So increase its capability. And the other side is China has a stronger willingness or resolve to defend its maritime claim, because China has settled most of its land disputes with neighboring countries. Of course, the obvious exception is the border disputes with India, but most other countries, China has already settled the land disputes. So that in terms of military modernization, China has shifted more resources to build sea power, the Navy, Chinese POA Navy. So that's sort of some background why China's sort of posturing over the maritime disputes become more assertive. But China has a key dilemma. So on the one hand, China wants to strengthen its claims, or strengthen its capabilities to defend its claims. So, but on the other hand, overall, China pretty much still wants to maintain peaceful and a stable relationship with all the neighboring countries. So then China has a key dilemma. So the Chinese analysts or officials, sometimes they talk about protecting rights versus preserving stability. So the Chinese word called Weiwen versus Weichuan. So Weichuan means protecting its self-perceived rights, right? Its self-perceived interest in these disputes. But also how China could defend its rights while without jeopardize relationship with neighboring countries. That's a very sort of dedicated dilemma. So I don't have a good answer how they can do it, but that's a key dilemma. Chinese analysts and officials frequently talk about this. The other illustration is the overall sort of situation in Asia. In Asia, some people talk about two orders: security order versus economic order. So what kind of role China could play in this security economic nexus? So how China, so could China transform its economic power into political power or even military and diplomatic influence in the region? Can China expand its power while reassuring its regional neighbors? So the other point is this kind of security logic versus economic logic. So what kind of role China is playing in this kind of two logics in East Asia or in Asia more broadly? So a few years ago, when Philippines President Duterte, he visited China for the first time, warmly welcomed by Chinese President Xi Jinping, and the relationship between Philippines and China improved after he took power. Duterte became the president of Philippines. But in the Chinese internet, there are some Chinese nationalists. I'm talking about not a diplomat, nationalists. They were joking. They were spreading a joke, sort of an imagined conversation. But I think the imagined conversation, even if by these nationalists, have some interesting point, is that this is not a real conversation, but an imagined conversation. As President Xi Jinping told President Duterte that if you say the South China Sea belongs to China, for each word, we will pay $1 billion. And President Duterte said, okay, may I say the South China Sea has belonged to the People's Republic of China since ancient times. Of course, that was a joke, but again, I think in this Chinese nationalist imagination is that China could simply use its economic power to change policy and preferences of those neighboring countries. But I think the reality is far from it. Probably it's the opposite. At least it's not always successful. Maybe China could achieve limited success regarding dispute with Philippines, but China is not successful to use military or economic coercion to change policy preferences regarding other disputes, right? So I think, but I think this joke at least illustrates the widest imagination of some of the Chinese nationalists. They want to say, okay, money could make anything happen, could even solve China's security challenge in the region. But again, in reality, it's far from the case. So in reality, we find that East Asia, many countries still rely upon the United States to provide security, especially in East Asia. Think about Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and to some degree, maybe Thailand and Singapore and others. So the United States, a lot of allies, regional partners in the region. So these countries, they still rely upon the United States to provide security. But economically, most of these regional countries, they want to take opportunities to cooperate with China because China provided very important economic opportunities for them. So even Philippines, right? So Philippines has serious maritime dispute with China, but the Philippines became one of the founding members of the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, several years ago. So that illustrates the two logic. So sometimes there could be some sort of dynamic for these regional countries, how they maintain relationship with China economically while defending their security claim. I think there's another side of the story that for China, it's the same, how China could maintain cooperative and a strong economic relationship with some of the neighboring countries, but also meanwhile defending its maritime disputes vis-a-vis some of these neighboring countries. But even I think that people worry about China's sort of emerging sort of coerciveness or coercion or assertiveness. But I think a lot of commentators, they're worried about China's hegemony in Asia is a little bit exaggerated. So even China tried to project these two types of image, be a responsible regional leader, but also a very credible sort of coercive image to defend its claims. But China is far away from becoming a new hegemonic power in Asia. So based on 4 simple reasons I want to highlight. One is geopolitical constraints. So China's neighboring countries, several of them are pretty powerful, like Japan, like India. So, and several countries even have nuclear weapons. So China is, in terms of geopolitical context, is very different from the United States. United States has 2 very nice neighbors, Canada and Mexico, separated by 2 oceans. So in terms of geopolitics, the United States is in a very good position, but China has a very sort of constrained geopolitical environment. So I don't think that will change anytime soon. So the second is in terms of material capabilities. Of course, China's rise is real. So China is now the second largest economy. Maybe 1 or 2 decades later, China might have potential to become the largest economy in the world. But in terms of capabilities in international politics, the size of the economy does not automatically transform into military technology and diplomatic influence. So there's a gap. Right, so I think we also need to see also enormous challenges also within China. So in terms of material capabilities. The third is, I call it self-defeating mechanism, in a sense that if China wants to become one of the regional co-leaders in Asia, that might be fine. If China wants to become the only hegemonic power, the only regional leader in Asia, that will generate enormous backlashes from the United States, from India, from Japan, from many other countries. Some of the regional countries will strengthen their security cooperation with the United States. So that means China must be more prudent in terms of its regional diplomacy. The third is ideational and historical foundation. So some scholars, maybe even officials in China, they used some sort of historical evidence. They try to demonstrate, okay, historically, China may be a benign leader in Asia, in East Asian history. But I never buy this kind of narrative. I think, I mean, the Chinese history, in Asian history, there are all kinds of violence, wars with neighboring countries and others. So the ancient Chinese empire, there are all kinds of conflict. So the historical argument, okay, in history, China was a peaceful, hegemonic power. I think that's a historical myth rather than historical reality. Let's be honest. So I don't think that's kind of provide enough or persuasive historical evidence to support the future, any future potential hegemonic power of China in Asia. So that's let me have a quick summary of my talk. What some of the message I want to emphasize. I want to emphasize, people talk about China's assertive turn in China's regional diplomacy, but I think it's not new. Like the coercive image, China assertive, it's not entirely new. It's a result of model factors, both international and domestic, but it reflects both change and continuity in China's regional diplomacy in terms of the so-called new assertiveness in China's regional diplomacy. So I think that the core logic is the same as historical pattern. China wants to project two types of images. The changing factor, one key factor is China's increasing capabilities, and maybe partially also domestic politics. And so we need to think about both change and continuity. The second key point I want to emphasize is that there are really two types of images or two masks in China's regional diplomacy. So maybe many diplomats from China and from other countries, because of the nature of their job, they typically only emphasize the first type of image, benign image, regional leadership, cooperations, peace. But there's always other side of the story. That's the coercive image. So that's always there. So we need to think about these two types of image together when we analyze China's regional diplomacy. The third, when we think about the emerging confrontations or rivalry between China and the United States, that really worry a lot of regional actors, regional states. So like Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, the Singapore Prime Minister, he often emphasized, quote, U.S.-China relations will define the tenor of international relations for years to come. We hope U.S.-China could find a constructive way forward. So basically, the idea is that a lot of regional states in Asia, in terms of emerging China's assertiveness, competition with the United States, from regional states' perspective, they don't want to choose sides, ultimately. They want to continue to maintain economic cooperation with China, meanwhile, strengthen security cooperation with the United States. So I think, but it's increasingly difficult. I understand, but I think the reality is a lot of regional states still want to try to avoid a real new Cold War between the United States and China. Okay, let me stop here. I look forward to your comments and discussions. Thank you.
Dr. Pu, thank you very much for your comprehensive and interesting presentation. We learned a lot. We have also received lots of questions. So let's move to the question and answers. The first question is, to what extent and how did the pandemic shape the diplomacy of China to its surrounding?
Oh, so how pandemic changed this kind of China's regional diplomacy, right?
Yes.
Yes. I think it's kind of a little bit can change and continuity. Of course, pandemics generate a lot of new dynamics between China and the regional countries. But I think the core sort of the logic I presented here still applied or still valid, in the sense that on the one hand, we see China still maintain its claim regarding those like maritime disputes, even border disputes with India. So that's still this coercive dimension. But on the other hand, China really wants to project sort of an image of, as a regional responsible leader in dealing with these kind of challenges. I think very much willing to cooperate with neighboring countries, right? So I think the other side of the story is very similar to China's regional activism after Asian financial crisis. So pretty much emphasize, okay, this is a crisis, but we need to work together. China is willing to provide public goods whenever possible, whenever needed. So I think the two images are still there. So we see the coercive images in maritime border disputes. We also see this region responsible leadership images in terms of dealing with the pandemics. Oh, I cannot. Oh, you mute yourself.
Sorry. According to why China has failed to resolve border dispute with India?
You mean why China? Oh, it's a. I think it's a topic. It's a topic probably deserve another whole talk, 1 hour, 2 hour. But put simply, I think I mean, for any dispute, I think if we want to blame fairly, it's not a one side's problem. I think it's two sides problem, right? So in terms of like even China-India border disputes, it's a very complicated. I think it's historically China and India see the issues very differently. And also both China and India are large and proud countries. For this kind of, it's so difficult to compromise. And I think some scholars might argue historically there was some sort of proposal from Chinese side. Premier Zhou Enlai promotes some diplomatic proposal, but due to complicated historical reason, both China and India lost that opportunity to solve it. But now the status quo is that it's become more difficult to resolve in the new era. So yeah, it's complicated. Let's put that way.
Let's look at the third question. Is it safe for developing countries like Nepal to participate in Belt and Road Initiative in terms of economy as well as non-alignment? How can BRI be helpful in economic development of Nepal?
Oh, so you mean in terms of which?
Like, is it safe for developing country like Nepal to be a part of BRI? And at the same time, is it good for economy as well as non-alignment? Because Nepal believes in non-alignment. It doesn't want to take sides of any power. Like during the Cold War, it followed non-alignment. So, yes.
Yeah. I think let me first okay, this is purely my personal opinion. There are different interpretations of BRI. So some Western analysis scholars, maybe some Indian analysis as well, purely see BRI as a geopolitical security project. But others see BRI more as an economic initiative, right? So I personally think somewhere between. I think BRI is primarily still an economic initiative, but it definitely has diplomatic and strategic implications. So it's still primarily economic. So with that interpretation, I think different countries might have different opinions regarding BRI, right? We see Pakistan is enthusiastic embrace BRI. India has strong reservations even against the BRI. But even India, interestingly enough, is a major participant and key member of AIIB. So it's not the fact that India opposed all sort of China initiated sort of economic initiative, but India opposed the BRI for geopolitical reasons and diplomatic geopolitical reasons. So in terms of Le Pol, so I would think some sort of at least independent judgment, I think might still be needed, in a sense that BRI is still an evolving, complicated project. So I think the key factor for Le Pol is to try to decide which particular project might be good for Le Pol's sort of economic, social development, rather than think too much about the geopolitical implications. In a sense, of course, Le Pol need to manage carefully about the relationship with both India and China. I understand, but I think ultimately BRI is not primarily a geopolitical project. It's primarily about economic infrastructure building. I think the key factor probably is indicator is still Le Pol's economic need, the social need. I think that should be the priority rather than the complicated geopolitical game. I think it makes sense for Le Pol's leaders to say, okay, this is for my own country's people, for our own economic reason. We joined this particular project, but not that. So, right. So I think put that into appropriate context.
Thank you, sir. There is one interesting question from our scholar from Bhutan. He is asking that there are 3 territorial areas of dispute between China and Bhutan, Jakarlung and Pasanglung and Doklam Plateau. In this context, examine the trend of Sino-Bhutanese ties subject to territorial dispute.
Okay, so these 3, yeah, I know the Doklam dispute that escalated into a very high level, so the tension between China and India. So I think I don't have a good answer, and to be honest, I'm not familiar enough with some of the specific historical context regarding this. But I think China has settled its land border dispute with most neighboring countries. So I think from Bhutan, I think it might be useful for Bhutan's scholars or diplomats or officials to examine how China settled other border disputes with other neighboring countries. Might learn some lessons. I mean, actually China compromised a lot, even with smaller countries. So that's an interesting pattern maybe Bhutan could learn from. So how smaller countries could even sort of take some advantages in terms of bargaining with China. So I think examine some other historical cases might help Bhutan to think about how to settle the border disputes peacefully without jeopardize overall relationship with China. So there's maybe some good historical examples.
Professor, there are few questions who are out of context, but it is on China. Like it's not particularly our topic, but if you want, you can attempt. If you want, you can skip them. Like there's another question: how do you see U.S.-China relation unfolding if Trump is re-elected, and how different would it be if he's not? Another question is very similar. How, like if the Democrats win the election, what do you think the Sino-American relation will be?
Okay. Yeah, I think the U.S. election. So basically, the U.S. election, how that impact U.S.-China relations. If Democrats Biden wins or versus Trump get re-elected, I think in the international media there are all kinds of speculations which candidate Beijing would prefer, right? I think that's a wrong question. I mean, not your question wrong, but I think it's a which candidate. I think ultimately U.S. election is depend on American peoples, American voters. It's not about the Beijing's preference or New Delhi's preference or Moscow's preference. It's about America's voters, how they will vote. But I think even from Beijing's perspective, there are different calculations. So some of the extremely hawkish zero-sum thinkers in Beijing, they actually prefer Trump win election. Maybe I say this, someone don't believe, sounds unbelievable. But the calculation is that Trump has damaged American power and influence far more than he has damaged China's interest, right? In terms, think about American leadership, American credibility with allies on the world stage. Trump has damaged America so much. If you are a hawkish person, officials, really, you don't like the United States. You want Trump to get reelected. Trump will further damage American power. Of course, U.S.-China relationship will be damaged in the process as well. But if some other people in China, more moderate thinkers, policy advisors, scholars, they probably prefer Biden win elections for at least 2 or 3 reasons. One is that Biden will be more predictable. So it's Trump, I think, although from a zero-sum perspective, he damaged American power, but he also damaged the world order in a very significant way, and also damaged U.S.-China relationship. So I think if Trump gets re-elected, I think the United States will in a bad shape to deal with China in terms of prestige and power. But if Biden gets elected, I think the United States and China might repair the relationship a little bit to some degree. Again, Biden will be more predictable. He will use more multilateral approach rather than bilateral sort of bilateral approach. But I think the overall U.S.-China relationship become more competitive, more difficult. I think that will not be changed. Whoever wins elections, even Biden becomes president, he will implement some tough policy against China, at least in some issue areas. We will not, I think even policy makers in Beijing, they are not envision that the U.S.-China relationship will get back to normal or previous era. So the U.S.-China relationship needs some sort of rethinking, a reset, sort of from both sides, whoever wins the elections. So.
Second is there any possibility to establish the liberal democracy in China with the help of neighborhood countries so that China can become superpower in the world?
So the question is,
like the question is, do you see the possibility of China adopting liberal democracy? or Western democracy?
Oh, okay. I think it's difficult in the short term. I think, unfortunately, in recent years, China's domestic politics becomes much tighter, sort of, to be honest, to maybe even more authoritarian than maybe 5, 10 years or 20 years ago. So I don't think that trend will be changed in the short term. So I think at most, in the next 20 or 30 years, I think China might slightly become more liberal, more open again. But I don't think it will become a liberal democracy in the Western sense, right? In the foreseeable future. So I think the best case scenario in the foreseeable future is China maybe still maintain its one-party rule, but within the party, there are more room for debate, discussions, so sort of internal sort of democracy within the largely one-party system. I think that's the more likely scenario. It's far from the possibility to change into a liberal democracy. And I think it should be careful. I think for a large country like China, I think important political change has to come from within, not largely from without, from outside. I think it has to come from the internal dynamics. I think if international pressure normally generated more sort of backlashes. So yeah, that's my personal opinion. Maybe wrong.
There's another question on like China's desire to build not only Sino-centric Asia, but Sino-centric world has threatened the US hegemony. In this context, do you see the possibility of new Cold War?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think there are some in the United States. There are worries that China not only want to build a Sino-centered East Asia, but also even China-centered world order, and that generated all the backlashes from the United States. I think that I think my own analysis that this kind of worry is both reasonable, but also a little bit exaggerated. I think China, it's maybe more debatable. China has willingness and capabilities to be a regional hegemony or leader in Asia. My own personal view is that China has capabilities and the willingness to be one of the leaders in Asia. It's more debatable China has the capability to become a global leader or replace the United States as a global leader, even become a regional hegemony. In my lecture, I already lay out 4 reasons. Even China wants to become a regional hegemony, there are important constraints in terms of capabilities, in terms of geopolitical constraints. I don't think it's realistic for China to become like a global leader replacing the United States. But I understand American politicians, leaders, some of them worry about China's potential. So that's one. The second point about Cold War. I think some sort of rising tensions might be inevitable between the United States and China. The only uncertainty is how we conceptualize the rising tensions, how to manage the rising tensions. So, but I think the Cold War is not a good analogy. Even people frequently, a lot of American or international commentators would like to use Cold War or new Cold War to describe US-China rivalry. Because why I think it's not a good analogy? Because in the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, they did not have any significant social and economic ties. They did not trade each other. They did not send international students to each other's country. They did not have strong social connections between the two countries. But the United States and China have maintained such a broad economic and social connections, right? Even Chinese leaders, many Chinese leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, send their kids to the United States to attend college, right? So that's unimaginable when we think about U.S.-Soviet relationship. I think we've seen the tension emerges. It's not a new Cold War. It's to some degree, I think people might pay more attention to historical example is Sino-Soviet split. That might be a more similar situation when two countries previously have strong economic social ties, but because of diplomatic political tensions, the social economic ties would be significant impact because of political tensions. I don't know how we use a new analogy, but I don't think Cold War is a good analogy. But I agree, the tension will be rising between the two countries. The only uncertainty is how to manage it, how to conceptualize the rising tensions between the two countries.
There's another question on digital strike where Chinese apps are being banned in India as well as in US. So the question is, how do you take India and the US banning Chinese application as considered as a typical digital strike? How should China counter the problems? What is your prediction of China's foreign policy for Sino-US relations according to the current economic and political climate?
So there looks like two
there are two questions. One is like how the Chinese apps are being banned in India and US. So how should China counter that problem? And second is, how can China deal with its foreign policy? Like how, to resolve US-China ties, tensions.
In terms of the TikTok ban, WeChat ban, I'm not very familiar with like the Indian situation, but I'm relatively more familiar with the American situation. My understanding is in the US case, it's much more complicated. Potentially, there might be more legal challenge against the Trump administration executive order. So it's still dialogues going on here. So in the US. But I think one of the most interesting comments I have ever read about this particular dispute from Fareed Zakaria, the CNN host, and a very interesting strategic thinker. He think, okay, now US is trying to ban TikTok and WeChat. The Trump administration is adopting the Chinese model in terms of cyber governance. Why? Think about which country really block all kinds of applications in the first place. It was China started this process. Think about the Great Firewall, Facebook, Twitter, and other social medias. They are all blocked by China. So in terms of cyber governance, there are two models. Traditionally, the United States and other leading democracy, they advocate an open cyberspace in a sense that we should not allow governments block different software, website. But China, maybe to some degree, in Russia, advocate the sovereignty model in a sense that emphasize sovereign government should have ultimate authority to control these software applications. It's a more nationalist model, right? So I think now Trump administration actually, to some degree, use China's practice to fight against China. So I think that's the reality. I'm not saying this is the correct approach. So this is like racing to the bottom, in a sense that China definitely, the Chinese government implemented this nationalist model in terms of cyber governance, but the United States traditionally is a model of liberal democracy, advocating a more open cyberspace. But now Trump administration is exactly imitating or copying the Chinese government's model. So that's, I think, a little bit problematic. But I don't know, so the future, how this will end in, because different from China, in the United States, the companies, they have powerful legal team to challenge government policy. So, and also whether Trump will get reelected, that's a huge, there's a huge uncertainty. If Biden took power, maybe the other administration will revisit this. So I think that's, but I don't know particularly about India. My guess is India is also has some maybe cybersecurity concern, but maybe more because of the border dispute, the nationalist sentiment, domestic politics, even protectionism. So a lot of complicated factors play a role in the decision.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
And the other, U.S. China, I think U.S.-China relations is the most difficult moment in 4 or 5 decades, maybe at least 4 decades, since reestablishment of the diplomatic relationship. I think the key problem, the long-term trend is beyond Trump. I mean, Trump is just speed the process. The problem is already there, far before Trump took power as US president. I think that the key problem could be summarized as two sort of leadership challenges. Number one, the United States worry China challenge its global or international leadership. Number two, China or Chinese leaders worry the United States challenge Chinese Communist Party's leadership in China's domestic society. These two types of sort of leadership challenges from both sides, they have existed for many decades. Just in recent years, these two worries become more sort of problematic. So that means the trend is so-called securitization. So in the US, if the United States worry China's challenge to its global leading position, that's not just about the military, it's also about technology, economic position. Then previously, a lot of normal exchanges like technology, economic transactions, previously maybe viewed as positive for both sides. But now the United States worry China's challenge to its position, its status. Now the US government see that as a threat. Again, if Chinese leaders worry about America's government's intention to try to overthrow Chinese Communist Party's rule, then even normal exchange, like in terms of social sciences, humanities, might be viewed as a potential threat to Chinese Communist Party. So that, I think these two types of trends have shadowed the bilateral relationship even before Trump administration. Again, I think if Trump gets reelected, situation might become even worse, but not necessarily good for the United States. I think the US credibility will be further damaged. But if Biden gets elected, maybe we at least we might see more dialogues, more communications to manage the tensions the disputes between the two countries. Maybe in the long term, the United States and China, they need to explore some new way to deal with each other. So that's, I think, the relationship in a position of repositioning, of resetting. So how rethinking the relationship and reset the relationship. It's in a critical historical moment in the bilateral relationship.
Let me move to the next question. It's on BRI. What is the future of BRI in post-COVID-19 world? Will US and China trade war affect China's BRI projects and Indo-Pacific strategies?
Okay, I think pandemic. I think even before pandemic, I see some sort of internal debates in China. Foreign policy strategists, policy advisor, international relations scholars, they already worry BRI might, to some degree, might become a case of China's so-called strategic overstretching. As a rising power, some scholars argue that China should focus on its regional interests without overstretching worldwide everywhere. So BRI, some of the strategic thinkers, scholars in China, they worry BRI is a little bit overstretching everywhere. That generated backlashes and problems in different parts of the world and also for China. So I think if we think about that, there are some internal debates, worry about BRI as some potential problem. But since BRI now is written into Chinese Communist Party's documents, even party charter, I don't think the China, I mean, it's a key project of President Xi Jinping. I don't think the Chinese government will totally abandon this project. They will not abandon. But I think they will do some sort of readjustment. I think that this kind of be more careful, evaluate project, more feedback mechanisms. I mean, even if some of you pay attention to Xi Jinping's speeches regarding BRI, even before COVID-19, he already talked about some potential problems. Chinese government is trying to address some of those potential problems. I think the COVID-19 pandemic further sort of strengthens that kind of rethinking. And I think BRI to some degree might be slowed down a little bit. Maybe the Chinese government would examine BRI more carefully. Again, my overall judgment is that the Chinese government will not abandon BRI, but they will adjust some implementation of BRI. So this is the first question. What's the second?
Second is that the trade war between US and China, will it impact China's BRI and Indo-Pacific strategy?
Oh, okay. Definitely, I think a trade war has damaged both China and the U.S. Economic interest in different ways. So I think in recent days, the Chinese leaders talk about, they always try to emphasize external coordinating both international factor and domestic factor. But now they slightly emphasize, the Chinese leaders slightly emphasize domestic market. I think if some of you read some news analysis, the Chinese leaders recently talk about China should emphasize, explore its broad, vast domestic market. So I think that's a new some sort of new thinking. I'm not saying the Chinese leaders will totally abandon international market. No, they will continue to be a key trading partner for many countries. But I think that they realize the vulnerability of this international trade. So I think they will emphasize more, slightly emphasize more about domestic market, but also regional market. If some of you read news, ASEAN country as a whole now is China's largest trading partner, replacing the United States as a top trading partner. So I think that the Chinese leaders probably will emphasize even more this economic cooperation with neighboring countries. But again, the Chinese leaders will not give up any hope to repair relationship with the United States, at least partially, right? So I think China will not give up potential trade relationship going on with the United States, but they will rethink about the vulnerability, international backlashes. They will emphasize more on domestic market, emphasize more regional cooperation. So that's, I think, the emerging trend.
Let's move to the last question, because we already, the time is getting over. Like, the last question is, how do you see the upcoming intellectual property and knowledge sharing perspective between China and US, looking at the case of Huawei and 5G and all those? And second is, how China and US will manage to deal with clash of interest situation at different front. One is like Indian Ocean region, another can be trade and others.
So there are two questions?
Yeah, there are two questions. One, the issue of Huawei and 5G, and second, overall, how US and China will deal with clash of interest. One example is, how will they manage to resolve that issue in Indian Ocean region, the South China Sea and all those?
So the second question, I still don't get it. The second question is about how China managing,
like how China and US will manage to deal with clash of interests, like clash of interest in Indian Ocean region, Indo-Pacific region. Second question is the case of Huawei or 5G.
Okay. I kind of agree. Any historical power transition, it's always chaotic, uncertainty, tension, even through war, right? The established power and rising power, they settle their disputes through war. That's a historical pattern. I think in US-China relations, we see some similarities in the sense that when China is rising so fast, that generated, the United States is pushing back, that generated tensions. That there are some similarities, I agree with that. But I don't think there's a high chance that the dispute will be settled through military means, in a sense that the United States and China settle their dispute over national interest, power, prestige through war. Because both the United States and China are nuclear powers, they have very strong military capabilities. I don't think like realistically, they have good options to settle their disputes militarily. But I agree, military, their professional job is to prepare for the worst case scenario. So the US military, Chinese military, they are prepared for the worst case scenario. I understand that. But in terms of probability, I don't think there's a high chance they will fight a real war through military means. But on the other hand, I think we can define war not in a military sense, but in a much broader sense. Then we see trade war, we see technology war, we see different kinds of war. So maybe war, if we understand it as a broader term, concept of conflict, I think US, China have broad sort of conflicts or tensions regarding trade, economic issues, technology issues, so all these long military domains, all kinds of tensions. So I think in this sense, the future of U.S.-China relations, instead of like World War III or like great power war between U.S. and China in a conventional sense, we might see frequent frictions rather than the real war, frictions or disputes over technology, economic. So I think that's the emerging trend. We might see a lot of tensions in different domains, but not typically, not necessarily, or primarily not in military domain. So that's my first comment regarding U.S.-China relations. The second, regarding 5G, Huawei, I think in the short term, the Trump administration has some sort of confrontational approach without a coherent competitive strategy to deal with the emergence of Huawei and 5G. It's sort of reflect some attitude, using sanctions, block sales, right? I think it's not a competitive strategy. It's a confrontation. Some American analysis even criticize Trump's approach as confrontation without a strategy. Confrontation without a strategy. In the sense that, okay, 5G is emerging, Huawei is emerging, let's block it. But that's not a competitive strategy. 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, a lot of American companies also suffer from Trump's policy, because a lot of like semiconductor producers in the United States, they sell their products to Huawei. If they don't sell products to Huawei, they will lose billions of dollars business. Eventually, some of these products will be replaced by other suppliers, maybe from South Korea, even maybe from China. So a lot of some of the sort of, because nowadays we are talking about economic globalization. It's not just about trade. It's very sophisticated transnational production network. American business, American companies, if they want to maintain competitiveness, they must join in the global production network. Trump's policy make a lot of American companies suffer, losing billions of dollars business, losing potential competitiveness in the future. That's number one. Number two, the best strategy to counter Huawei and 5G technology is to develop America's own 5G and America's own sort of high technology. But Trump, he's cutting funding for science and technology. His immigration policy is driving global talents away from coming to the United States. I don't think his policy is good for America sort of future competitiveness. So again, I hope like in the future, if the United States could have a better sense of competition from Huawei or Huawei's 5G technology, the best strategy for the United States is counter with a better, more competitive technology and products, not simply block the particular products or technology. I think that's maybe a wider strategy going forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pu, for your interesting presentation and enriching discussion. We are really grateful for your time, and we learned a lot tonight. We'd like to have you again in future, maybe in real, once the pandemic is over. We would also like to thank our participants for their presence and wonderful questions. We did not edit or we did not pick any question. We just picked randomly as we received them. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day, Professor, and good night to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. And also thank you for your thoughtful questions. I mean, I look forward to have a chance to meet some of you in face-to-face, person-to-person meeting in the post-pandemic world. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.